Hello and welcome back to the Fantasy Playmakers. With the NFL season officially coming to an end on Sunday, it's kind of time to shift over, from in-season, the playoff talk. Now we're going to be talking about the NFL draft, talking about free agency, a lot more Dynasty fantasy football content. And so in the next few days, I'm going to be going through my 2022 rookie rankings. So I'm going to go by position first. So running backs, wide receivers, quarterbacks, maybe tight ends, maybe not. Not a ton of depth at that position for draft prospects, even though this class isn't the worst at that position. And then I'll do like an overall big board. Maybe I'll do super flex and one quarterback, but maybe just go through like a round or two of ADP and kind of go through how I would rank those players. But in today's video, I'm going to be going through the top 8 running backs in the 2022 class. And overall, this isn't the strongest running back class. This is definitely not like the 2020 class, where we saw Jonathan Taylor, J.K. Dobbins, Antonio Gibson, Cam Akers, all those studs coming off the board. And it's really also not as strong as last year's, where you still had like Najee, Javonte, some of those guys. There may not even be any first-round running backs in this class, but there are definitely some solid, day 2 options, second round, maybe third round. And then obviously you're always going to have guys going in the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th. But let's just jump into the rankings. And starting off here at number 1, I have a Breece Hall out of Iowa State. He really checks almost every box that you'd be looking for a running back prospect. He produced early on as a freshman. He was the lead back in his freshman season. He was the workhorse all 3 years he was at Iowa State. And he was also effective in the receiving game really all 3 years. So he caught at least 20 passes in every single season. And then he was really just turned it on and was dominant as a sophomore and a junior. In those 2 seasons, he went for 3,526 scrimmage yards and 46 total touchdowns. When you're looking at his build, he also definitely has that workhorse size, coming in at 6'1", 215 pounds. When we're looking at some of his flaws, he did struggle a little bit in pass protection and could be a slightly more physical runner, but luckily, he has the size and the athleticism to make improvements in those areas. Right now, Breece Hall has all the traits to be operating as a 3-down back in the NFL, and it really is just going to come down to draft capital. I feel like right now there's a pretty clear, top 3 running backs. That's Breece Hall, Isaiah Spiller, and Kenneth Walker. And so really, I feel like a lot of this could just come down to draft capital. If Breece Hall gets picked in the 2nd round and Spiller and Walker, fall to the 3rd, Breece Hall is probably going to be the number 1. But maybe Spiller goes in the 2nd, Hall and Walker go late 3rd, then I feel like that's probably enough to bump Spiller up because you just know he's going to get more opportunities with that higher draft capital. And speaking of Spiller, I have him here at number 2, coming out of Texas A&M. And I feel like a lot of the same positives I mentioned for Breece Hall also apply to Isaiah Spiller. He has the size to be a workhorse back, coming in at 6'1", 225 pounds. He was also the running back 1 for his team in all 3 of his collegiate seasons, and he also showed that he is a very competent receiver, also caught 20-plus passes in all 3 of his seasons. He basically put together very similar numbers in all 3 of his seasons. When we're looking at some of, his downsides, he doesn't have elite breakaway speed. We didn't really see him get caught from behind a ton, but we're not sure if he's going to be able, to accelerate away from those NFL caliber, corners, safeties, all of that. So that'll be interesting to see how he tests at the combine. He could also use some minor improvements as a blocker. And the reason why I'm saying this, you might be thinking like, blocking doesn't apply to fantasy, but if you're able to be a competent blocker, that is going to lead to you getting, more opportunities on the field. So you probably aren't going to be a 3-down back if you are just absolutely horrendous in pass protection, because they can't have you out there on 3rd and longs unless you are running a route. And if you can't block, then it kind of becomes predictable in those situations. So he's another guy who could use improvements as a blocker, but another guy who has that 3-down running back potential, which is what you want to see, because that's going to be, those top ceiling guys who can be workhorses, potential RB1s in the future for fantasy. Then at number 3, I have Kenneth Walker out of Michigan State. That really wraps up, the consensus top 3 running backs. And Walker's kind of an interesting case here. He's not like Breece Hall or Isaiah Spiller, who were dominant all 3 seasons in college, because he really went from minimal production in his sophomore and freshman seasons to just a breakout junior year. And a lot of that has to do with him transferring from Wake Forest to Michigan State before, his final season. With Michigan State, he rushed for 1,646 yards and then 18 touchdowns. He doesn't really have many glaring concerns as a prospect. He's not as physically, imposing as a Hall or a Spiller, coming in at 5'10", 205, 210. That's not, terribly undersized. If he was like 200, under 200, then it would be a little bit concerning. But you can be a workhorse at 5'10", 210 pounds. That is totally in the realm of possibilities. There are a few other factors that could limit his 3-down usage. He's not a solid blocker, and the problem is he doesn't have that solid frame to fall back on. So a guy like, Hall or Spiller, they don't have to be great technical blockers because they have that huge body, to get in front of the defender. Walker, like I talked about, is just not as big. But I think the most concerning area would just be his lack of receiving work. In 3 college seasons, Walker only caught 19 passes. So that's not to say, he can't catch the ball or he's terrible there. We just really haven't seen it. Personally, if it was some, strength of Walker, I would imagine playing at 2 different, universities, he would have gotten more opportunities. So we'll see how he looks at the combine, but that's kind of the most limiting factor that drops him to number 3, and that is why I have both Spiller and Hall kind of clearly ahead of Kenneth Walker. Now on to number 4, I have Rachaad White out of Arizona State. Pretty solid drop-off from the top 3 running backs, but still, a solid prospect. White was not, an elite top-tier high school recruit. He kind of bounced around all over the place before arriving at Arizona State, but he made a clear impact in his junior season. In just 4 games, he rushed for 420 yards on only 42 carries, so 10 yards a carry, and then he also caught 8 passes for 151 yards while scoring 6 touchdowns. And remember, that was all in just 4 games. Then as a senior, he went out, rushed for 1,000 yards and 15 touchdowns. He may not be, super explosive near the line, compared to some of these other backs who I have ranked ahead of him, but I do think his pass catching ability makes him a very interesting option. He caught 43 passes in his final season for 456 yards. He is definitely one of the best pass catching backs in this entire draft. And at 6'2", 210, he's not one of these hybrid guys who's only going to be a receiving back. He does have that 3-down build. Draft capital could be a potential issue because we just don't know where he's going to fall right now. If he falls to day 3 in round 5, 6, 7, that would definitely be tough, but he could easily be picked in the 3rd round and become a very, very solid pick for fantasy football. At number 5, I have Kyren Williams out of Notre Dame. He's by far the smallest running back on this list, coming in at 5'9", 195 pounds. Those numbers, when you hear them, definitely do not scream workhorse to you. I don't think, I'm saying he could never be a workhorse, but it is rare at that frame to be a 3-down back at the NFL level. Williams is very agile, and he's explosive out in space, but, as you'd expect with that frame, he can struggle with contact. I think probably the biggest positive here is that Kyren Williams is very effective as a receiver. He logged 35 receptions and 313 yards as a sophomore, and then 42 receptions for 359 yards this past season. I feel like you're going to see a lot of people comparing him to Austin Eckler, which to me, I just do not think that is fair. If you want to talk about his, absolute ceiling, sure, that's fine. But just comparing these receiving backs to Eckler because, that's what Eckler does, I just think it's kind of lazy because Eckler is basically a unicorn operating as a 3-down workhorse at his size. And remember, he may have never even got the opportunity to do that if Melvin Gordon didn't hold out. So for every Austin Eckler, there's going to be a J.D. McKissick, a Naheem Hines, a Giovanni Bernard, who are receiving backs, but just are probably never going to get the opportunity to be a 3-down workhorse in the NFL. But, the solid thing here about Williams is that hopefully his floor is a solid receiving back. So even if you pick him and he doesn't reach that elite Eckler ceiling, he still has some value to kind of fall back on. Now at number 6, I have Brian Robinson out of Alabama, and he's kind of a tough one to rank here because in 2021, he absolutely balled out. He was a stud, rushed for 1,337 yards, caught 35 passes for 296 yards, and scored 16 total touchdowns. So just hearing that, you'd be like, wow, he should be an elite prospect, second, third round pick. The problem is it took him forever to break out. So this past season was his 5th college year, and he will be 23 by the time of the draft. And that is definitely on the way older end in terms of prospects. But also remember that Najee Harris was basically the same age coming out of school. So it's not unprecedented for someone to, come out and still get high draft capital. I don't think he's going to be picked anywhere near Najee was, but just something to keep in mind. And the reason why I can give Robinson a slight pass for that late breakout is because he was competing for touches with absolute studs. So basically, Najee was a year older than Robinson and then was just ahead of him on the depth chart his entire time at Alabama. So Robinson was unable to overtake, the number one role until Najee Harris was gone. Obviously, it would be nice to see him go out and get more touches, especially when he's like a 4th-year senior, where he really didn't get a huge workload until that 5th season. Right now, I think the biggest thing holding him back would just be draft capital, because right now he is projected to be a day 3 pick, which means he may never even get, a real opportunity to be a stud running back in the NFL. Now at number 7, I have Tyler Allgeier out of BYU. He is a redshirt junior and has operated as a complete workhorse over the past 2 seasons. Overall, he's a fairly well-rounded prospect. He's got the workhorse size at 5'11", 220. He's a physical runner through contact, explosive in the open field. He does lack some explosiveness near the line of scrimmage compared to some of the other guys on here, but he's also a fairly fluid receiver out of the backfield. Even though, he didn't have a massive role, you could definitely see it on tape. I think for me, the biggest concern with him would also be draft capital, just like Brian Robinson. He could, shoot up my rankings if he's a 2nd or 3rd round pick, but right now I just don't know if we can kind of assume on him being picked there. And then the final player in this top 8 is going to be Zamir White out of Georgia. I don't really love a lot of the options here coming in at number 8. Many thought White was going to have a monster 2021 season, but he was honestly fairly underwhelming, rushing for 856 yards and 11 touchdowns, and then added 9 receptions for 75 yards. He definitely wasn't a major factor, as a receiver. We kind of saw Dalvin Cook's brother, James Cook, get a lot of that work, but without some major, all-around improvements, I really just can't see Zamir White being much more than a power back at the next level. He's also likely going to be a 4th round pick or later, which isn't super promising. That is going to wrap it up for my 2022 running back rankings. If you guys enjoyed this video, do me a huge favor, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Going to be putting out more content like this. Over the next few days, I'll be going through my wide receiver and quarterback rankings for the 2022 draft class, and then probably like a round 1, round 2, maybe ADP, or my kind of personal rankings. But thank you guys for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next one.